In the season finale of Bleach: The Thousand-Year Blood War, the Soul Society prepares for the inevitable war against the Wandenreich. Ichigo learns the world-shattering truth about Zangetsu, while Uetsu Nimaya forges him a brand new pair of zanpakuto. Yes, this is it, we're finally here. This is our last in-depth spoiler review of the season. Thank you all so much for joining me each and every week to discuss the series. It's been an awful lot of fun. This one is a bit late, an unfortunate knock-on effect of both episodes coming out the same day and over Christmas, but we're finally here. I wanted to give episode 13 in particular the due time it deserves, and as a result I think this is going to turn out to be a pretty hefty review. Before you watch this video, if you haven't checked out my in-depth review of episode 12, I would implore you to do that as well. Of course, this is the season finale, and therefore we have some of the biggest events and twists of the season taking place in this final episode before the break, so there is an awful lot to talk about. So without further ado, we should just dive straight into this episode, but before we do, make sure to hit subscribe if you haven't done already for more Bleach content like this every single week. I would really love to hit 200,000 subscribers before the anime returns in July. If you want to be a part of that push, I would really appreciate it. And if you enjoyed the video, make sure to give it a thumbs up as well to help support me and the channel. And if you want to take that support for me another step further, I do also have a Patreon as well. And I just want to say, as always, a massive shout out and thank you to each and every one of you over there as well. And as always with our in-depth spoiler reviews, I'll be taking a look at this episode from the perspective of someone who has read the Thousand-Year Blood War arc in its entirety, so anticipate potential spoilers not just for this episode but for future story content ahead as we take a look at what this episode added, what it changed, and even what it took away from the source material. So I think the writing was on the wall for some time regarding where this first part of the Thousand-Year Blood War arc anime would actually end, and I have to be honest, I think ending with The Blade Is Me is a truly fitting place to stop for now. Ichigo's trials, his struggle for acceptance, his quest for understanding, and ultimately his realization as to the true nature not only of his zanpakuto but of his relationship with Zangetsu as well, is a brilliant place to cap off this first part. But as always, before we dive into our spoiler analysis, we must first look at what this episode actually covered. So this episode covered 5 chapters total, and pretty faithfully, all things considered. The chapters covered in this week's episode are as follows. Chapter 538, Standing on the Edge, 539, Prob-less Progress, 540, The Sword 5, 541, The Blade and Me 2, and 542, The Blade Is Me, of course the title of this episode. So episode 13 opens immediately following on from the end of episode 12, as chapter 538 does from 537, save for that cliffhanger that's been removed from chapter 537, although I have a feeling we might see it again later on. Isshin wonders how Ichigo is going to get back to the royal palace, but right on cue, Mera appears out of nowhere. The visual effect of the Chokaimon returning, which I always interpreted to kind of look like a rush of air and wind within a black vacuum, is gone here, replaced with a simple black screen. Now, once Ichigo reawakens back in Uetsu's pit, which sounds kind of weird thinking about it, Mera's explanation of the Chokaimon's return functionality is cut from the episode, as is her explanation that Uetsu always planned for Ichigo to return. In fact, Uetsu's actual introduction is removed as well, and now it kind of just looks like Uetsu hasn't really moved from this spot for however long Ichigo has been gone. Instead, we move right along to Uetsu instructing Ichigo to return to the test. This scene is actually slightly extended here in the anime. Here in the episode, Ichigo turns to face the Asauchi and simply walks through them with a single-minded determination. He knows which one is his, but they all bow to him in numbers regardless as he walks past, each one turning black as he moves between them. It's really awesome because them turning black seems to mean a couple of things. It seems to be a way of showing that they're all offering themselves up to become his blade, but really only one can truly be it. And then also, them turning black seems to be a measure of them accepting Ichigo, finally, as a true Shinigami, as black seems to be the colour of Shinigami power in general, which is why it's a big deal when his particular Asauchi peels away upon contact to reveal a white core. In the original chapter, while Oetsu is speaking, he realises the Asauchi are already bowing to Ichigo. As is usually the case with these kinds of changes, I think both work really well. I think the immediacy of the original works well in the original chapter format as you turn the page and instantly see the change in nature of the Asauchi. But here, the moment feels more grandiose in the episode. Ichigo feels more powerful, more confident, more in control, as though he's seeking out exactly what he needs. It's clear Oetsu was expecting them to fight him again and for him to have to actually beat down his Asauchi, but the truth is, they're all prepared to accept him as their master now. He is fully confident in who he is and in his own soul. But of course, the moment Ichigo extends his hand to the Asauchi and the Asauchi takes it is a moment we've seen many times now in the opening each week. It's a powerful moment of acceptance, of true acceptance. In taking the Asauchi's hand and seeing its true form, that of a Shinigami Asauchi but bearing the mask of a hollow, Ichigo is accepting himself and the hollow power from within, which came from the created being white. As Ichigo chooses his Asauchi, Oetsu says he'll personally reforge it for him now. I think it was a few weeks back now, I was wondering how they might structure this final episode, whether they would shift around the Shinigami training segments, but probably wisely, they're sticking directly to the same structure as in the source material, for the most part. We move over to the 10th Division where we see some officers training in swordplay for the upcoming battles. To be honest, I loved all of these moments. Seeing the Shinigami in training like this, seeing the wider world of the Soul Society, I'd have happily had more chapters fleshing out these moments. For the most part, the story sticks with those who lost their bankai, though it also takes the time to highlight a couple of other faces as well. One nice little detail is the anime reveals the name of the 10th Division's sword instructor Shutetsu Nagakiso, but his name was never actually revealed in the chapter itself, only in the post-chapter omake that Kubo includes in the volume releases. This scene has also been cut down a little bit as well. In the original chapter, the scene focuses on two random officers who chat secretly to each other as the training goes on. One of them asks the other one, what he thinks will happen to Hitsugaya, and the other says that he's lost his bankai, therefore it's over for him, before wondering what will become of the 10th Division in general. It's a tiny interaction, and I'm not surprised it's gone for the sake of time, but it's also a pretty intriguing look at the importance that's placed on bankai among the lower ranks. And honestly, that makes total sense for so many of these low-level officers who probably aren't even seated. The idea of a bankai must be almost mythological, unattainable, something that makes you a captain. And now that Hitsugaya's is gone, this random soldier thinks that he's done as a captain. But of course, Hitsugaya himself shows up to the training. Outside of the missing reaction from these two Shinigami, the rest of this scene plays out basically exactly the same. Hitsugaya joins the ranks of the officers and trains in Zangetsu, and of course, it includes his line about training and mastering his bankai to the point where it could be considered a true bankai. The notion of Hitsugaya completing his bankai will of course come up again considerably later on down the line. After this, we see Kensei leading Hisagi out into the Rukongai districts. The translation of Kensei's line here, at least on Disney Plus, is "I want you to master bankai." This line makes a lot more sense, I think, than what we saw in the original chapter release, as it implies that Hisagi at least does have a bankai already, but he's only just learned it and is in the earliest days of having one. But then Mashiro arrives. This is the only time we ever get to see her in the 1000-Year Blood War arc, so I really hope they change that up in the anime and include her later in the story as well. But then she then holofies. I think it looks really awesome. I love how fast it is, how almost subtle it is, but the transition to her actually wearing a hollow mask is so smooth and fluid. I just love how it looks. But honestly, this is also quite nostalgic in some ways as well, as it's one of the rare instances that we actually get to see a Vizard use a mask in the arc. She then punches Hisagi when he tries to protest this new training. This is also one of the many beatings that Hisagi will get in the 1,000-Year Blood War. As Kensei remarks that, you shouldn't think that I won't let Mashiro kill you, I'm not as soft as Tosen was, Hisagi says to Kensei that although he respects him greatly and looks up to him, he has no right to badmouth Captain Tosen. I've said this before on the channel, but I've always thought this was a really dumb sequence that honestly makes no sense whatsoever. I get that Hisagi respects Tosen, and Tosen taught Hisagi many of the lessons that he has carried with him even today. But of the people who can and do badmouth Tosen, Kensei has perhaps more right than literally anyone else. Tosen was his subordinate and explicitly betrayed him, his commanding officer, literally stabbing him in the back and killing many of his comrades and supposed friends. Tosen almost single-handedly destroyed the 9th Division's leadership in Turn Back the Pendulum and was completely remorseless about it, as well as going so far as to ruin the lives of Kensei and Mashiro too, not so much as batting an eyelid when Aizen moved to kill these hollow-fired Shinigami before Urahara was able to save them. Maybe Hisagi doesn't know about any of this, but I find that hard to believe as well. But then Kensei doesn't seem like the most emotional guy, so maybe he's never confided in him. Also just a random little art thing here, but Hisagi looks really strange, I think, when his 69 tattoo is the same colour as the band tattoo on his face. Another point is that I'm kind of surprised they left this moment totally unchanged. It's possible it was simply too big a scene to cut, especially since they had a pretty hard end point for this episode in mind, but considering they removed the mentions of Ishin's bankai, I'm wondering if they have any plans to show Hisagi's at all. Considering that line of Shinji's in the trailer for part 2 that I mentioned in my live reaction for that trailer, where he says something along the lines of, "I'm about ready to upend this entire situation," which really does sound reminiscent of the line he says in Can't Fear Your Own World before activating his bankai, I'm definitely, hopefully optimistic, but I'm not actually expecting anything. Now here, rather than move on to the cliffhanger for chapter 538, the episode instead skips over it to the start of chapter 539. I think this is smart. So far, they've moved Komamura's scene, and considering out of all of these scenes, that is definitely the biggest and most impactful long term. It makes sense to put it all in one place and leave it as the overall cliffhanger to the Soul Society section before returning to Ichigo. And so, beginning chapter 539, we start off with the 12th Division. We've got a few establishing shots that show that most of the research and development department above ground was totally destroyed, forcing them all into an underground lab. Speaking of the destruction of the Research and Development Institute, it's a shame that we haven't had any kind of an update on what happened to Jidanbo. Akon's introduction and discovery that Mayuri has been locked in his lab all this time is exactly the same as it appears in the original chapter. I love this scene because it's Kubo's subtle way of showing that Akon really is Mayuri's protege, even if they outwardly don't appear to be that similar. Akon is probably the only person daring enough outside of Kisuke Urahara to interfere with Mayuri personally and probably still get away with it. Now, interestingly, this scene is a little different here to the original chapter in a very crucial way. In the chapter, Mayuri is explicitly talking to what appears to be a body lying on top of some kind of surgical bed. He's speaking to them as though they have just been recently revived. You can't really make out any of the dialogue whatsoever thanks to the static, but the only line you can make out is Mayuri asking if this person in front of him can actually move. It looks a lot like they're talking, like I said, to somebody on a bed, and later we see that Mayuri has of course resurrected several Aranka, but it actually seems from an image we later got, I think in again some supplementary material it was, that he's talking with a resurrected Kira. However, this doesn't seem to be the case at all here in the anime. We can pretty clearly make out what Mayuri is actually saying. Here, he says that they will use the existing tissue as a host to give birth to a new Ashisogi Jizo. And of course, what he's describing here is his newly modified Bankai, Konjiki Ashisogi Jizo Matai Fukuin Shodai, which we wouldn't see until much, much later on, but he is describing it here almost perfectly, implying that this is actually what he's working on here instead. It's a pretty big change, but an interesting one, and one that I think might actually have better payoff than what was featured in the original source material. And if we look closely, the imagery does appear to be changed somewhat as well, featuring something that looks to be perhaps considerably more bloated than the silhouette of someone simply lying down, so potentially they have changed this scene entirely. But I've got no real problems with it because, as I mentioned, I think this will have better payoff than whatever Kubo was trying to do originally. Another scene that's almost totally different is the scene at the Omaida household. This is the first time we see Mareo Omaida in the original story, though we've seen the Omaida family members before, again in supplementary material. But here, she asks Omaida to play ball with her, and he doesn't want to as he's relaxing. She then begins to cry, and this is where the two scenes diverge. In the anime, upon seeing her cry, Omaida relents and decides to play with her after all, throwing her ball up into the air. But in the original chapter, he stubbornly says that he's too busy to play with her, at which point their brother, Saburo, appears and offers to read a book with Mareo, but she claims that they're too creepy. Mareo then leaves Omaida to try and escape her brother. It's kind of interesting that this was changed, this was completely changed, because it obviously cuts out the character of Saburo, even though he's not a particularly big deal, but I can't help but wonder if they've tried to make Omaida connect with his little sister a little bit more to make what happens to her in the future hit that little bit harder. Regardless, the end of this scene is the exact same, where Omaida laments that Soifon decided not to take him training with her. It's a slightly weird scene because Omaida seems to want to train, but also can't be bothered to do it on his own, but I guess that fits him pretty well. We then cut over to Soifon and we see her performing one-handed push-ups atop a tall mountain. As far as the captains who have lost their bankai go, she definitely gets the least amount of subplot dedicated to her, which is a little bit of a shame, but it's nice to see her training hard regardless. At this point, we then find ourselves with Komamura and the cliffhanger carried over from the previous chapter. Iba's scene has been cut where he's performing lifts outside the cave and he wonders where Komamura has gone, what's taking him so long. This is a bit of a shame because Iba barely gets any scenes as it is, and then we're supposed to accept him as a captain later on. But inside, Komamura talks with his great elder about the state of the world. I really enjoy the portrayal of the elder. Not only does he appear and feel absolutely massive, but his voice sounds ancient and filled with a world-weary wisdom, but also a sagging tiredness as well. Seijin asks to be taught their clan's ancient technique, only for the elder to simply laugh in his face, and again you can feel that power, the beating of the wind as the elder laughs at Komamura. Komamura says, you know, I no longer wear the helmet, the world is currently in a place where our clan can live out in the open free of shame, but that world is currently under threat and it will continue to be so if we sit idly by and do nothing about it. Much as it was in the original chapter, I think the Elder's speech here is truly fascinating stuff. He tells Seijin that the world will never be destroyed, it will simply be controlled by someone else, and when it is, their clan will continue to live on in the shadows no matter what. Nothing that happens will affect them, implying that they have been around since maybe even the dawn of time and have seen the changing of hands, the passing of control of the world numerous times already. I'm not sure how old these guys actually are, and personally I'm still of the opinion that the original captain of the 7th Division, Nobutsuna Shigyo, is in fact an ancestor of the Beast Clan himself. But Komamura gives this impassioned speech saying he wants to change things for their clan. They don't have to live in the shadows anymore for the sake of their children and their grandchildren. The elder rebukes him and stands to his full imposing height. The way he's animated rising up is genuinely a bit unsettling, and I think again they did a great job showing this colossal ancient mass shifting for perhaps the first time in whoever knows how many years, and the majesty that comes with something like that. The elder tells Seijin not to disrupt the clan's peace or he will crush him, but Komamura challenges him to try. It's a shame we don't see any of this fight here, but I guess there is a chance we might do when we return to this interaction a little later on in the second invasion. But now we move on to the real meat of this episode, what everyone was actually waiting for as we return to Ichigo's story. Ichigo, the Asauchi, and Oetsu slide down a tube and land in Oetsu's personal forge. This is a little weird as Oetsu tells Ichigo to come on up and I'll reforge it for you, only for them then to both go back down the way Ichigo presumably came. But the forge itself is honestly a really cool location. It looks totally unique and makes for a grand stage for Ichigo's zanpakuto reveal. The comedic scene where Oetsu asks Ichigo if he's okay having slid down the tube head first, but Ichigo shouts that Oetsu pushed him is cut here. But Oetsu introduces his forge and explains this is why Hooden is built on a cliff. He explains he needs all of this surrounding water in order to reforge a bankai in this way before telling Ichigo to be prepared to say goodbye to Zangetsu. The forge itself doesn't look exactly how I imagined it. For example, the back wall is lit up by several multicoloured spotlights, which while I didn't anticipate that, I do think it actually looks quite good. In a way, it adds a layer of otherworldliness to the forge, which makes sense considering how ancient and integral it is to everything in the world of Bleach. But it also calls back to Oetsu's introduction a couple of episodes ago where he basically appeared in this massive crazy display of lights and music. But as we begin chapter 540 now, Oetsu tells everybody to come together and begin his show. The Sword Five appear, each one landing a hit on Oetsu as they make their entrance. I always did find it amusing that they seemingly had this big entrance planned, but one of them just ends up face planting the floor behind them. The Sword Five are weird characters. Designed, I think, to really only exist for this purpose. They're basically zanpakuto that have been created explicitly to help forge other zanpakuto, as each one plays an integral role in the forging process. But Oetsu then demonstrates his incredible control over the Asauchi as he summons Ichigo's Asauchi and transforms it into a blade-like material. This scene is actually slightly extended here. When the Asauchi becomes a blade, rather than landing in the ground directly in front of Oetsu like in the chapter, it instead flips and flies and zips all around the place as Ichigo wonders what is going on. Now we actually get a cool piece of new information here that feels on the grand scale of things very minor but actually is quite appreciated. As Oetsu begins the forging process, the member of the Sword Five, Nonomi Nomino, leaps into action. She's seen with what looks like chiseling equipment, and as this stone material bursts out of the ground, she quickly sculpts it into the forge's chimney. This isn't in the chapter at all, and in fact, of the Sword Five, Nonomi's role was always left totally unknown. But Mera then breathes fire into the chimney itself, activating the furnace. We then see Nonomi again, this time chiseling a basin for the next member, Toki. Again, that was not seen in the chapter either. By sobbing uncontrollably, Toki is able to generate flowing water for the basin to help cool the blade throughout the process. The tallest of the girls, Hasuka, uses her twin pigtails to catch the flying Asauchi in midair and pin it down for Oetsu, while the final member of the five, Sumiko, is a really weird character. She breaks one of her teeth and transforms it into Oetsu's hammer. I'll be totally honest, I have no idea what the significance of this is, if it means anything that the hammer comes from one of her teeth, or if it's just to showcase that she has literally been designed to help Oetsu forge zanpakuto to the point where each one of her teeth can act as a disposable hammer for Oetsu to use. I'm not really sure, it's kind of weird. And there are some interesting design quirks with this character as well, such as the fact that all of her nails are chipped, but we don't really see enough of her to kind of glean any kind of insight, or at least I don't think so anyway. But we then see Oetsu preparing, tying up his hair, removing his glasses, and then he starts forging. As he brings his hammer down onto the metal inside the flame, sparks fly everywhere. It's a really cool sequence. I always loved this. Getting to see Oetsu actually forging a zanpakuto, as I think I mentioned either last week or the week before, is really awesome stuff. It's really cool getting to see a zanpakuto being made from scratch, is some awesome world building. But as he begins forging, he asks Ichigo what he's thinking about, and he explains the reasoning for why he took his glasses off as opposed to leaving them on now that there's flames in front of him. It's so he can see better the colour of the flame as he continues to hit the blade. Basically, all of this so far is very similar to how it appears in the source material. And now here we get more very important exposition. This really details and breaks down how Ichigo's powers actually work within his soul. And to be honest, I might do a separate video about all of this in the days and weeks to come, just kind of really condensing exactly how Ichigo's powers work and how and why I think they make total sense. But Oetsu says that Ichigo probably thought when he saw that Asauchi, when he saw this white being with the hollow mask, it probably reminded him of his inner hollow. And Ichigo says that, yeah, I did, that is correct. Oetsu says that he uses the Asauchi themselves as a catalyst to draw the Zanpakuto's true form out from within a Shinigami's own soul. So again, basically to break that down, when the Asauchi turned into that blade of light upon Oetsu's command, that was Ichigo's true Zanpakuto being extracted from Ichigo using the Asauchi as a vessel, as a catalyst to do so. This is why Ichigo's blade is pure brilliant white. We can assume that when Renji went through this same process, when Oetsu commanded Renji's Asauchi to become a blade, Renji's was probably black. But Oetsu explains that Aizen's hollow white was created by merging many Shinigami souls together, and that's also how he creates his Asauchi. As I mentioned in my live reaction, it sounds like a very suspicious and unethical thing that is mostly swept under the rug. It's alright when Aizen mentions he's doing it because he's a villain, but then you realise the entire foundation of Asauchi is also built on that same practice. I do think it's supposed to add a nice, intriguing element of moral greyness to the Soul Society and its traditions and history on the whole, as the Soul Society in the Gotei 13 has always been a morally grey institution, and that's what makes it so interesting in my opinion. But it's possible as well that Oetsu didn't just kill a bunch of Shinigami to achieve this, and instead used what was ever left over and lingering from Shinigami who did die, what was left, what remained of their souls. Why he thought about doing this and what drove him to use Shinigami souls, we unfortunately don't know, and probably will never find out. So another important thing to remember is that the hollow that attacked and bit Masaki was no ordinary hollow. It was an experiment created by Aizen, specifically designed to virally infect and hollowify other targets. It was in itself a conduit for Aizen's hollowification experiments. So the hollow Reiatsu that lived within Masaki was in itself like a viral infection. It was designed to forcefully hollowify. And as we know from the extra line we got in episode 12, that hollowification would be passed down to Masaki's descendants. So when Ichigo was born, with natural Shinigami powers of his own, the hollow Reiatsu within forcefully fused with them. So again, to simplify, that's why hollow Ichigo looks the way he does. He is Ichigo in his Shinigami Shihakusho wielding a Shinigami's blade, but with the outward appearance of a hollow because he is a successful merging of both of these Reiatsu. A new line is actually added here as Ichigo begins to realise the truth of what's going on. Oetsu reaffirms that he said Ichigo would be saying goodbye to Zangetsu. As Oetsu declares whoever is in his soul has been masquerading as his Zanpakuto the entire time, we move in to Ichigo's inner world. Now, this is a big moment, so let's break it down. First, let's talk about the pink sky. Obviously, Ichigo's inner world has never been depicted this way before, and it's most obviously a direct callback to the anime's opening. Or maybe the opening itself has always been foreshadowing this moment. I've seen some people find the pink sky distracting or off-putting. I get that, but I actually quite like it. I think it feels cyclical. We've been seeing this colour every single week, and now, in perhaps the biggest moment of the season, it's back again. Everything, every week has been leading to this moment. We just didn't know it. The colour is supposedly strawberry as well, which of course is a pretty heavy-handed reference to Ichigo himself, though I personally don't think this is really meant to be anything other than a reference to the opening and how we've been heading to this point the whole time. Next, we've got the big twist itself. One of the biggest reveals in all of Bleach that I put as my number 2 biggest plot twist in the entire series, only behind Aizen actually being a villain. In my opinion, this is a very difficult twist to get right in the anime, and they actually go about it in a very different way to the original chapter as well. The chapter is more focused on shock value, and it is the medium to do that. As Ichigo faces Zangetsu, Uetsu asks if he knows who he is. Ichigo says he does, but Uetsu says he isn't Zangetsu, and in fact Ichigo has seen him many times before, including as recently as being the enemy who trampled Soul Society. At this point in the original chapter, we turn the page and we are greeted with this enormous, overbearing, almost suffocating close-up of Yhwach himself, looking totally domineering. We're in the exact same spot as Ichigo, seeing the same thing, experiencing the same reveal through the same eyes, and it's horrifying. In that point, Ichigo is a conduit for the reader. We experience that moment at the exact same time and pace, and it works really well. The impact is massive. The anime doesn't really do this. As Uetsu reveals Zangetsu is none other than Yhwach, the camera continues to just slowly draw closer to Zangetsu before coming to rest on his face. This time, I think both work, but I do personally prefer the version from the source material. I think the anime versions should have kept Zangetsu far away from the camera as Uetsu spoke to emphasize that distance and the fact that in our vision, in Ichigo's vision, at this moment he is obscured, before suddenly flashing up a shot of Yhwach at the moment of the reveal. After that, you can slowly begin to bring Zangetsu into focus. One thing I do really like with the anime's reveal, however, is that Ichigo's face isn't shown until later on. I like that as we begin chapter 541, Ichigo's back is to the camera and you can tell he's processing what's going on. I like that we first see his face as the realization finally sets in. The camera spins round and we get that look. We see that look of total aghast disgust that in the source material as well, Kubo completely and utterly nailed. It's a wordless moment, but you know exactly what Ichigo is feeling there and then. Just one of the best faces Kubo has ever drawn, and I think they managed to encapsulate that very well here in the episode too. One thing that's really cool is that this chapter is titled The Blade and Me Too, not only highlighting the separation between Shinigami and Zanpakuto that Ichigo needs to overcome as the very crux of his training here, but the first chapter titled The Blade and Me is right the way back when Ichigo first learns the name of Zangetsu, which is awesome. I will say, and I never really noticed this before, but it's almost a bit of a shame that it starts raining again here. I get why it does, but we just had the rain motif with Everything But the Rain and its poignant ending where the rain finally lifts off now that Ichigo knows the truth about himself. After everything we went through in that flashback arc, it leads to the moment where the clouds disperse and the sun rises again, only for it to immediately start raining here mere minutes later. It is cool, however, watching the evolution of the downpour inside his soul during this conversation. I always find this moment to be so interesting. Presumably Old Man Zangetsu knew this moment would come one day, as he himself says, and probably has been preparing himself for it. Maybe Uetsu even spoke with him directly beforehand. I imagine Uetsu probably has that power, since we can see that Uetsu himself is even able to communicate with Ichigo while Ichigo is in his inner world. But as Ichigo hears that devastating truth from Zangetsu's own mouth where he simply says, "Ichigo, I am not Zangetsu," the building they're on smashes in half and they're both plunged into a bottomless ocean. This is Ichigo's soul at its most tormented. Even in the Deicide arc, where Ichigo was suffering from an internal despair over what happened with Ulquiorra and he found himself submerged in water, the buildings around him were still standing, still showcasing his utmost desire to protect. But here, The town has been completely annihilated. Ichigo's soul has been smashed to pieces. What is there left to protect if Ichigo doesn't even know himself if everything has been a lie? Everything has been destroyed, and now is the time to rebuild and pick up the pieces again. I think the anime takes some nice creative liberties with this scene that work really well. Once Ichigo is underwater, all colour and light is stripped from the world. He's at his lowest point mentally ever. He doesn't know which way is up. The only light source is beyond the surface of the water, completely out of reach and, at the moment, unattainable. Zangetsu himself is silhouetted against that very light source, blocking it out and obscuring it. This moment is left almost completely unchanged, which of course is for the best. Seeing them both through the shattered carcasses of the buildings is some great imagery for the current state of Ichigo's soul, and the shards of glass that float past both Zangetsu and Ichigo, reflecting each of them, seem to represent their different facades and Ichigo's broken mental state. Zangetsu then unfurls his black cloak, revealing his Quincy-esque undershirt underneath, as well as Ichigo's true flaming power. Zangetsu explains that if Ichigo continued along the path of a Shinigami, then one day he would have had to kill him himself. In this moment, Ichigo believes Zangetsu is readying to fight him, but Zangetsu reveals that over time his heart softened as he watched Ichigo grow. The sadness on Ichigo's face as Zangetsu decides to step away is palpable. It's really well done. And that realization just washes over Ichigo as Zangetsu begins to crumble, he begins to vanish, revealing that pulsing light source above the water once more. And as Ichigo races towards Zangetsu, not ready to let him go, his hand outstretched, Number 1 begins to play, which of course is so good, it's so perfect. I feel like it's a little risky in some ways because Number 1 is of course a very upbeat, very triumphant theme song for Ichigo himself, and to play it so immediately after an incredibly sad and depressing moment, I think takes a lot of guts, but I think they pulled it off really well here as the scene does transition from emotional and downbeat to triumphant, rising, powerful, and it goes hand in hand with the music. But of course, as Number 1 begins to blare, begins to pick up speed, all that's left in Zangetsu's wake is Ichigo's true power, embodied by a massive flaming sword, enshrined, encircled by the orb of light above the water's surface. Zangetsu tells Ichigo to take his true zanpakuto, the true Zangetsu, as a massive light explodes, ending chapter 541. Having taken the power, Ichigo, now at peace, realizes there were never lies in either of his partner's actions or words. Old man Zangetsu used the power of a Quincy to save him on numerous occasions. It is weird to think retroactively now that Ichigo supposedly beat Zaraki with the power of a Quincy, especially since it was Ichigo's hollow that appeared in that moment behind him as his torrent of Reiatsu. With things like that, I do think there are some instances that don't quite line up regarding this twist, but for the most part, this is a fitting end to Ichigo's journey and all the many trials and tribulations he's found himself going through throughout the course of Bleach. Now that he's finally at peace, colour returns to his world, and as he races upwards, bounding from building to building, leaving behind the depth of the water and heading for the surface, Ichigo agrees to accept both Old Man Zangetsu and White as Zangetsu itself. You know, it's definitely a shame that we don't hear from White himself during this exchange, but it is emotional, seeing a look of pride on his face as Ichigo reaches for the light. As Ichigo bursts back into the real world, he clamps down on the flaming sword itself, giving it some of his soul and completing the forging process. As Ichigo lifts his blade from the flames with a seeming extreme weight, a massive heft, the combination of his own roar and Oetsu screaming that this is your zanpakuto really make this scene work very well for me. I honestly love it. It's bombastic, it's triumphant, and it feels like a victory lap for our main character. As Ichigo swings his blade, evaporating the entire ocean around the palace, the next section is changed ever so slightly. In the original chapter, it's Mera who exclaims that the water has gone, while Toki asks if anyone has ever seen this before, to which Nonomi says that she hasn't. But in the anime, Mera says nothing, and it's Hasuka and Nonomi who exclaim about the water, while that second scene is cut entirely. Meanwhile, Oetsu's own line about the sea being dried up by the immense heat and Reiatsu saying that that's the amount of water needed to cool this blade's soul is cut as well. Instead, we move straight along to him slotting his glasses into place and asking how Ichigo feels and if he can get along with those new Zangetsu. I love the way both blades gleam in the light. They look incredibly sleek, though I do kind of wish the actual shot of Ichigo holding his new Zangetsu had a little bit more oomph to it, a little bit more impact, maybe just some slight more build-up, but regardless, it's an iconic and awesome looking shot anyway. A new shot is added in where we get the reaction of the Sword 5, where Mera exclaims that Ichigo now has 2 blades, and Oetsu has a brand new line where he says that yes, they were both real all along, reaffirming what Ichigo said about there being no lies. Both of their power was his to use all this time. But as Ichigo thinks to himself as he looks down at his new swords that he won't ever ask for Zangetsu to lend him power again, nor will he tell White not to get in his way, his blades crumble and fade away. The small Quincy blade turning into a crystal blue light, while the large Shinigami blade becomes a burning red energy. But in the end, the colour of their power doesn't matter. Both sources of Reiatsu lift into the air and become one unifying golden light surrounding Ichigo. Finally, what was once separate has become one. Ichigo finally gets it. In this moment, we can circle back around to what Oetsu lectured Ichigo and Renji on before their training. What is a zanpakuto to you? A partner, an ally, a friend, a mentor, family, a lover? No, it's none of those things. A zanpakuto, your zanpakuto, is simply you, yourself. It's a part of you and always is and always was. Oetsu once asked the question, who is superior, the Shinigami or the zanpakuto? The answer is neither, because they're one and the same when in perfect harmony. Knowing this, Ichigo is finally ready for whatever comes next. I think this is all handled extraordinarily well. I mean, artistically, it looks absolutely lovely. I especially love that moment of understanding with Ichigo where he looks down at his blades, where the gold Reiatsu lifts up, gilds his face in a beautiful soft light. He looks absolutely fantastic as he closes his eyes and he thanks Zangetsu for everything, finally in the right headspace, finally having become essentially a true Shinigami. Really, really awesome seeing both blades representing both his individual powers, the spirits of White and Old Man Zangetsu lingering over him. They've always been there for him. He just didn't quite understand how or in what capacity. They've always been him. Never a force to ask for help, never a force to oppose, never a force that tried to actively get in his way. All this time, they have just been Ichigo himself. So I think, all of that is just handled extraordinarily well, but we're not quite done yet. As we end chapter 542 and the episode, we're treated to a chapter-accurate title page for the episode, The Blade Is Me, but the cliffhanger of 542 is actually removed here. Instead, we get another cliffhanger that focuses on the Quincy, our missing cliffhanger from chapter 537 that appears at the end of Everything But the Rain. As we return to the dark, shadowy palace of the Wandenreich, Yhwach, sitting atop his throne, once again coated in that silvery blue crystalline light, welcomes back Hashwolf and asks if he was successful. Unlike in the original chapter, we already know what Hashwolf was up to thanks to the ending of episode 11. Stepping aside, Hashwolf introduces someone as they stride into the throne room, and Yhwach welcomes their new guest. It's none other than Uryu himself, now wearing the outfit of the Wandenreich. Yhwach smirks and says they'll fight together, calling him his son. This is a really awesome place to end the season on. It makes total sense. It's a great cliffhanger to leave people clamoring for more in the wait for July. Uryu looks amazing in this lighting and this outfit. Interestingly, I wonder if they removed the lines about Katagiri's death from last week's episode to make it a little more ambiguous as to Uryu's true intentions. Getting to follow him in the anime and then arriving at this conclusion makes for a very interesting journey for him. But of course, that is the end of the episode, the end of the season finale of the 1000-Year Blood War arc part 1. Of course, there's no preview poem this week, but we do still have some predictions for presumably episode 14 when it returns in July. But before we move on to our predictions, I just want to say that releasing episodes 12 and 13 together feels a little bit unfair. Episode 12, as good as it is, never really stood a chance. 13 is fantastic, a great way to end this first part. The stuff at the beginning of the Shinigami is great, don't get me wrong, but everything with Ichigo is an emotional roller coaster that's handled, I think, pretty well from start to finish, and I especially love the look and feel of everything. I especially love the artistic creative liberties that they took with the Ichigo and Zangetsu conversation, and I really love that amazing triumphant sensation with number 1 playing as Ichigo draws his brand new blades from the fire. I think this finale worked exceptionally well. There are a couple of small things I would have changed here and there, like how I mentioned I would have maybe done the Zangetsu Yhwach reveal ever so slightly differently, but for the most part I think this episode and this first part has been a real success. Before we end this review, let's take a look at some predictions. When we return in July, I'm anticipating some kind of a recap to begin with, which might mean we can have slightly fewer chapters covered in episode 14 than we might normally have had. Excitingly, for me at least, the first episode should at least have a partial focus on the Quincy as we cover chapters 543 and 544. It might be a little bit weird moving right from the cliffhanger of 537, introducing Uryu into 542, which just moves right into another scene featuring the Wandenreich and another introduction for Uryu, but we'll see how they handle it. Of course, a major part I am really looking forward to is finally properly meeting Askin Naklavar, who does appear for the first time properly in 543. We have technically seen him once before, but only for a single frame. I'm very, very excited. Genuinely, I can't wait for this episode. Much as in the same way as I couldn't wait for these chapters during the original run, I was dying at this point to see the Sternritter again, bearing in mind the wait was considerably longer for those chapters than it has been for these episodes. We're not really waiting as long, although of course the wait for July is definitely adding on to that. But I am very, very excited to see the Quincy in full force, to see them interacting. I really hope they add at least a couple of additional scenes here, maybe even going so far as to tease some upcoming Sternritter that we don't see for ages. For example, the Schutzstoffel. That would be so awesome. Imagine getting to see characters like Gerard or Lille or Gremmy way before we actually do in the second or even in the Varvel invasion. I would absolutely love that. I think, however, we'll probably only get the one episode of reprieve before the second invasion begins, as I think this first episode is very likely to end on chapter 546, with the second invasion getting underway. That would mean only 4 chapters are being covered in this next episode, but with a potential recap included, I could see them doing that. But it is possible that there might be an additional episode in here before we actually get to the invasion. Some of the dialogue in the trailer for part 2, which seemed to be between Ichigo and Ichibei, does not occur in the original source material, and perhaps implies that we will actually see a little more of Ichigo's training than we did before. Unless, of course, that interaction is just an extension of this shot from the beginning of 547, I think it is, where Ichigo appears to be inside Ichibei's sanctum, but we will have to see. Alright guys, that's it for this review of the season finale, episode 13, The Blade Is Me. I really hope you enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments below what you thought of this episode. Did it live up to being a finale of this first part of the 1,000 Year Blood War arc. I'd love to hear your thoughts down below. Let me know what your favourite moment in the episode was as well, and let me know as well what your favourite episode was from this first batch of 13. I'd love to hear it. I really do appreciate, and again, just want to give a big shout out and thank you to all of you for tuning in every week to both my live reactions and my in-depth spoiler reviews. I really do appreciate it, and it was a huge amount of fun as well. And I think overall it's just a great way for us to all enjoy and experience the anime together. So I really do appreciate all of you coming and showing up every single week. Make sure to check out my review of episode 12 if you haven't done already, and don't forget to hit subscribe for more Bleach content like this. But until next time, guys, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.